Happy Passover to everyone who's celebrating the holiday. In this video, we're going to ask a question. Is there evidence that the Passover story actually happened, or are people just celebrating a myth? Let's take a look. For those of you who don't know, Jews, Christians, and Muslims all believe that God punished ancient Egypt with 10 plagues for their enslavement and mistreatment of the Hebrew people, and refusing to let them leave the country with Moses so that they could have freedom once again. The 10th and final plague was the death of the firstborn. All of the oldest children in Egypt would die, except for the Israelites, as long as they sacrificed a lamb and painted the blood of that lamb on the doors of their homes. The plague would then pass over the Israelite home, sparing the family, hence the name Passover. Now that story sounds like a myth, right? It's fine to admit it, that's what I thought growing up. But let's take a look at the archaeological evidence that has surfaced in relatively recent decades. First, is there evidence of a plague at that time in Egyptian history? The answer is yes. After decades of academics saying the Exodus story must be a myth because they haven't found strong evidence for it, archaeologists around 1991 found what have been described as death pits. And in these death pits were large numbers of Egyptians that were suddenly buried due to some calamity, bodies just thrown on top of bodies. And it's thought that that disaster was a plague. And that plague, according to some specialists, dates to the time of the Exodus. But there's more. The Bible says the Hebrews were enslaved in a part of Egypt called Goshen. In the 1960s, archaeologists began studying a site in Egypt called AVARIS, which corresponds to Goshen. Then, in the 1990s, researchers from the Austrian Archaeological Institute made a big discovery there. This used to be the home of a massive Semitic population, just like the Hebrews. And there is evidence that that Semitic population was enslaved and terribly treated later in its history. A second enslaved and abused Semitic population was discovered at El-Lahun, 120 miles south of Avaris. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. These two enslaved Semitic communities, around the time of this plague that struck the Egyptians, suddenly vanishes. Where'd they go? The only answer I can think of is that they suddenly picked up and left Egypt. They were able to escape, or Egypt let them escape, because there's no evidence of a sudden genocide against them where all of them were massacred. So they obviously left. So we have evidence of a massive plague striking the Egyptians during the time some experts believe the Exodus happened. We have two enslaved and abused Semitic populations, just like the Hebrews, suddenly vanishing around the time of this plague, likely immediately afterwards. Is that story starting to sound familiar to you? Now, finally, what about testimony? Ideally, you will have testimony that matches from both sides of the conflict, the Semitic side and the Egyptian side. On the Semitic side, we already have the testimony. It's called the Torah, or the Old Testament. And that book of Exodus is not written as a fantasy story. It wasn't written as a myth. It does count as a historical record. It does count as a testimony of what allegedly happened. The debate is whether it's accurate or how accurate, but it is a historical record. So that side is taken care of. On the Egyptian side, there are two written records testifying to some of the events of Passover. The Ipuwer Papyrus is an Egyptian account, apparently an eyewitness account, of a disaster, which some experts date to the time of the Exodus, the time of the Semitic account. And the Egyptian eyewitness account in the Ipuwer Papyrus is stunningly similar to what you would read in the Semitic account in the book of Exodus. And specifically when it comes to Passover, there's this line, but you really got to read the whole thing. But pay attention to this part. Behold, plague sweeps the land. Blood is everywhere, with no shortage of the dead. Children are dashed against the walls. The funeral shroud calls out to you before you come near. Woe is me for the grief of this time. He who buries his brother in the ground is everywhere. Wailing is throughout the land, mingled with lamentations. Now, we've also seen other translations that are a little bit different. And one of them says, the children of princes are dashed against the walls. That would line up even more closely with what the book of Exodus says about the oldest son of the Pharaoh dying in this specific plague. And there's a second Egyptian testimony, again said to have been written at the time of the Exodus and around the time of the Ipuwer papyrus. So it's all coming together, time-wise. At Kahun, where the enslaved Semitic population was basically caged in and guarded, Egyptian writing has been found that references a plague that struck the country, and the author calls it an evil hour. So let's summarize. First, the Bible says God sent plagues against Egypt, including a final 10th plague that kills the firstborn. At the time that the book of Exodus says this happened, there are death pits showing mass burials of Egyptians due to a plague. Second, the Bible says the Hebrews, an enslaved and abused Semitic population, are allowed to leave Egypt right after the 10th plague. In recent decades, archaeologists found 2 enslaved and abused Semitic communities, and these communities left apparently right after a devastating plague. Third, we have 2 Egyptian testimonies, apparently eyewitness testimonies, of a devastating plague. Again, the testimonies' descriptions match the Semitic testimony found in the book of Exodus, and some experts believe the timing of the testimonies when they were written match as well. So they're all describing the same events from different points of view. So I ask you, the viewer, is the Passover holiday based on real events? Are those who honor Passover celebrating history? Or are they celebrating a myth, a feel-good story? Now, if you're looking for even more evidence that the Exodus story is credible, look at our film that has gotten over 7 million views in 42 languages. It's gone viral. I stutter when I read that because I still can't believe it. Over 7 million views in 42 languages. It's called Finding the Mountain of Moses, the Real Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. And that covers the second part of the Exodus story. If you're interested in the first half, like the events that we've been talking about, the best documentary out there is Patterns of Evidence by our friend Tim Mahoney. So if you pair Patterns of Evidence for the first part of the Exodus story with our Finding the Mountain of Moses documentary for the next part of the Exodus account, you're going to be amazed at how strong the evidence is. I strongly recommend that you and your family and your friends watch both films right before Passover every year. Make it part of your celebration, part of your ritual. Now, we're hoping to keep producing videos like this every week or two, and we also want to continue to do research on the ground in the Middle East, like you've seen. That's really exciting. We've got amazing leads to follow up on, but we're entirely dependent upon viewers for support, and frankly, our cash reserves are gonna run out in the coming months if we don't get help. So we appreciate your prayers and we appreciate any type of support that you can give us. If you want these videos to continue, please consider making a tax-deductible donation of at least $1 for us using the links in the description box below. Thanks for watching and happy Passover.